Just to give you a little bit of a political backdrop, Albania has just recently, in April, end of April, had elections where the Socialist Party won its third mandate. The first mandate started in 2013 after a very tough period with our democracy, and we've been trying to improve things ever since. Here I will go into the presentation so that we can continue to follow each of them. So I've taken here the last 11 years in terms of displaying what has exactly happened. We were not very well connected to international markets, especially in terms of foreign financing in Albania. So the crisis of 2008 got mitigated, but then it became a supply chain crisis in Albania. And as you see, from about 2010 until 2013, growth rates started to go down severely. It is cyclical because usually we export energy in the first quarter of years, and this is why you see there's always a fat tail almost. But what became more problematic with the going of time was that we became over-reliant to our water reserves in terms of producing our energy. We had elections in June of 2013, and the government then spent 93% of the entirety of the budget until the elections in order to ensure that they maximized their effects on the elections. But what that produced was another big drop in economic growth. So we found economic growth at minus 1.1%. You can see that then we had a period of growth going from 2014 to 2018, where it was more or less sustainable. We had great help from our supporters and colleagues at the Center for International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School. As one of the main points of the campaign was to focus on re-engaging new engines of economic growth, and in that they helped us. And we also had one of the last successful programs of the IMF in the Balkans, which was concluded successfully in 2018. And which helped us stabilize our public finances and our sectors that had become a big drag to the economy, especially the electricity sector, which because of privatization, nationalization of the privatization, and a slew of other issues, had become a $1.1 billion hole for the economy of Albania. At the time, Albania's GDP was around $13 billion, to give you an idea of the perspective. So one of the first things that we had to do in the first mandate was to set on a path of structural reforms. Basically, almost everywhere we looked, there were things to be done. In the energy sector, we had this hole through the companies that produced, transmitted, and then distributed energy to customers, where they were all indebted to one another, and then all the government's institutions were indebted to them. Losses in the energy sector were 46% of all energy in the system. They are now 22 and going down. We had to do fiscal consolidation that would have been growth friendly, because we had to balance the IMF on one side trying to tell us not to spend too much, but at the same time needing to reboost growth right from the first quarter of 2014. Pensions at the time were costing the government about 2.1% of GDP. Together with the World Bank, we worked on a structural reform so as to basically lower their over-reliance on fiscal incentives over and over, and they are now more manageable. Deregulation, digitalization, education, administrative, and territorial reform, where we went from 366 local governments to 61, making them at the same time also economically feasible. Of course, not all of them, but the most part of them. Two, basically at the end of the first mandate, so before the elections of 2017, to go into the justice system reform. Now, Albania had a justice system in the early 90s that was completely comprised of judges that had studied for the old system, so they were communist. And because of all the problems that we had with the system, including the persecution of people, they were all sacked all at once. And instead of them was a new caste of judges was created. judges, lawyers, and prosecutors, who had done little study, but who through the first 2 decades of our transition took Albania through a roller coaster ride, because justice then became justice for sale. And because of it, we are still in the process of undertaking this quite painful justice system reform, whereas we are vetting all the judges, and around 55% of them have not made it through the vetting process. But the new economy was working. We worked with the CID on a manufacturing sector reform that basically started producing effects right away, with growth well over 20% from the first year alone. We continued that with focusing on big infrastructure projects and projects that would help Albania in terms of FDI. Sorry about that. So the biggest project that we found on the pipeline coming in was the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. But of course, this growth was focused on 3 main engines: the historic growth of Albania until 2013. The big one from the budget was infrastructure. We needed to redo our roads. Our railways don't function, but we did the one airport that we had, and we were working on ports at the time. The second one was remittances. Until around 2010, Albanians, being the first generation Albanians, were sending a lot of money back home, as happens with all underdeveloped countries that open at once, as we did in 1991 and 1992. But from around 2008, especially with the coming of the economic crisis, the rates started to fall dramatically, being halved in a period of just a couple of years. And the third one was the construction bubble, because in communist times, we couldn't have houses. So all the houses were owned by the central government. So because of that, we had a massive demand on housing in Albania that fueled growth. Fortunately, some of the reforms started producing very good means. We did a new budget law and then a new management of public finances law that were producing good effects. We wrapped up the program with the IMF successfully. We won the elections for the first time in Albanian history. One party won over 50% of all seats in parliament. And so we set on the path of consolidating the reforms and ensuring sustainable growth for Albania. Unfortunately, this all came to a very abrupt halt on November 26, 2019. We had one shock, which was 6.4, and then over the next 3 months, another 2,900 aftershocks. 11 municipalities, this is wrong, 11 municipalities were touched, where most 38% of the people in Albania live. We had 51 fatalities and over 900 injuries. The problem was that we took a massive hit of damage to the economy, valued between 10% to 15.6% at the time. The damage was massive, meaning that we had to reconstruct a large number of buildings. So the problem became, first of all, trying to handle this immediately, and then secondly, being at the end of a calendar year and being able to move enough resources to handle this crisis. Fortunately, all of us, me and myself included, moved to the ground almost immediately. I think on December the 2nd, I became head of one of the districts, head of the local emergency management board, together with colleagues from all other ministries and walks of life. All of the neighboring country helped us with searching teams and with teams to actually evaluate what the damage was and how much these buildings could resist, as every day almost we had 50 to 100 shocks for about 2 months, and it became really basically nerve-wracking. Kids were drawing buildings being shattered and falling down all over the place. To give you just an example, in the city of Lach, north of the capital of Tirana, out of 117 total apartment buildings, 72 of them have had to be brought down because they could not resist even much smaller magnitudes of earthquake. This was also because the communists did a shortcut, and the bricks were not bricks, they were silicon, vulcanized silicon bricks. So basically they completely crashed. So as soon as we started to move with this, we had a large investor conference that was called in Brussels on February 7th in 2020, where basically through the work of our diplomacy, but mostly through the work of our prime minister, we ensured that we receive help in the form of grants and soft loans from over 50 partners and donors, including countries and multinational government organizations, to the effect of 1.15 billion euros, which then ensured and enabled us to begin the process of reconstruction, a process that the government plans to have finished by the end of next year. So losing a lot of money and then embarking on a massive reconstruction, everything seemed fine. And then, as everybody else in the world saw, we had to go through COVID. Now, for countries like Albania, where tourism, like in most countries, was one of the main drivers of growth, having grown by double digits for most of the past decade, this was a great hit. In terms of the external shocks, this had a very negative impact on the economy. Our economy went down annually by 4% for the first time since, and you can see the curve there, how 2019 impacted growth, especially compared to forecasts. But it was a severe shock to the economy. We all went under lockdown, and then the problems with the opening, we couldn't travel anywhere, people could not come back to the country. So it became a very, very large issue to manage. But we reacted quickly. Unlike most other countries in Europe, as soon as the vaccines were ready, we started vaccinating. We did not wait for the programs of the EU or the UN that distribute these vaccines to countries around the world. We went to the market directly. We brought in the Chinese vaccine and the Russian one to ensure that the effect was not widely spread. And even at the beginning of the crisis, we even helped out our neighbors. Italy, for example, which is a G7 country, where we sent over 100 doctors to serve there for a period of time, and then they came back because the need was very large here. But fortunately, we did not have IRs filled out to the fullest, because we started turning over hospitals very quickly, and we did not resort to having all regional hospitals turn into COVID hospitals. The problems then over the past 8 years that have hindered growth for Albania, and trying to look at it from an economist standpoint, are that the infrastructure was completely run down, and we managed to not invest in it for so long that all of the investment had to be done anew. And because we had no laws regulating where people were stationed or where they could go and build their houses, we had a very strange system of privatizing land after the communal land of communism fell. We gave everybody who had been working as these enterprises, state-owned enterprises, small plots of land all over the country. So basically everybody built right on the main roads, because there weren't that many roads. And this has become in recent years a major problem and a hindrance to infrastructure growth, because expropriation costs are incredible. As far as the business climate issues that we had, justice reform has helped us develop a lot of new mechanisms and ensure a lot of investor safety. Over the past 8 years, the stock of FDI in Albania has grown at about $239 million by quarter, meaning that the entire stock of FDI has grown by about 140%. But the problem continues to be that we are focused in some sectors, and we are now trying to refocus the entirety of the economy. For example, in energy, we're not looking to alternate our sources of production of energy. And the crisis that is incumbent right now is a perfect example of that. Albania produces more energy than it actually needs. The problem is that you need more energy at peak times, and you can never produce enough at peak times, not with our present capacity. So you always export at the lowest given price, and you have to import at the highest. And this is why we are moving towards solar panels and also towards thermal centrals. Two of the good news that we've seen in 2021 so far, and this as we have gone from a third quarter of 8 years ago when the government was being changed, where growth was minus 1.1%, to a third quarter when, if a new government would have come in, growth was 17.8%. Of course, the hindrance of COVID and the effects of COVID make this similarity not very effective. But Albania basically gained all of the lost jobs by January of 2021, and we had a very good season, especially in the summer, for tourism, and our production expanded. We, from 8 years ago, when we were importing 6 to every unit of export, we have now half that, and exports, especially agricultural and manufacturing exports, are going up at very good rates. The attempt of the government, this third mandate, will be to go into major infrastructure development programs that would help Albania, a country that was the North Korea of Europe, connect to its neighbors and connect to the networks of Central Europe. Secondly, focus more on these new jobs. As the Economist Intelligence Unit says, about 85% of all jobs that will dominate the world by 2040 have not been created yet, and they all are tech dependent. So we are now trying to recalibrate the focus of both of our system of education and our economy towards these higher growth sectors. And then one of the big expectations, not just of Albania, but of all of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans, that include Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania, is the path towards the EU. Until 2013, you have to understand, the leaders of the Western Balkans had never met together. They are now meeting on a quarterly basis. Unfortunately, the process has not moved as far ahead as it should be. The problem that I have with this, as a diplomacy major and somebody who has worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and for Europe, is that we have this process that was spearheaded by the German Chancellor, and Madam Merkel did a very good job in bringing all the leaders together and in aligning our economic, social, and development interests to those of the EU through regional co-investment, the regional coexistence, and the 4 core freedoms of the EU: free move of the free flow of capital, of people, of merchandise, and of course of brains, to say it in the HKS work. We have moved a lot along this path of removal of barriers between one another, but the problem is that the process of EU integration has not moved as fast as the countries itself. For over 2.5 years now, the European Commission has been suggesting to the member countries to open negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia, and always because of political problems with one member or another of the Union, we are being set back after having completed all of the conditions, which I would like to point out have been the hardest ever imposed on any country. What that has produced in the Balkans now, trying to look at not just the economic situation post-COVID, but also of the regional situation, is that you have 6 countries and they are all in different stages of integration. Serbia and Montenegro are discussing the chapters of integration with the EU. Albania and Macedonia are waiting for the date of this official conference to be scheduled and set up for over 1.5 years now. Our expectation is that this happens sometimes before the end of the year. And Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina that are completely blocked in this process by internal problems. Kosovo having fulfilled the criteria from no visa for no visa travel to the EU, but still not being granted this. What this means is, and here I would like to finish the presentation and get back to all of you, what it actually means is that we are now stuck in a bit of a limbo. We know that there is this potential for growth and development that does not belong and depend solely on the actions of the government. We know that none of the 6 countries of the Western Balkans has the budgetary means to ensure that we can undertake these massive projects. But at the same time, we are hoping that at some point the EU begins to look at this again geopolitically and geostrategically. The Balkans are the gate to Europe. Most of the conflicts between East and West have gone through this part of the world, and with the situation all around the world, we could all use more linkages, more connection for better development and for improving the livelihood of all of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Etjen, for what has been an excellent and very insightful presentation. I think our audience, who many of them are not familiar with Albania, have been able to learn about the challenges that the Albanian economy and policy environment has faced over the last 10, 15 years. Even more, some of the future challenges in terms of EU integration and in terms of post-COVID recovery. And beyond Albania, many challenges are common for the entire Western Balkan region. Let me zoom in into some of the aspects of the presentation, and I will have a particular focus, given this development talks series, just center of attention on the learnings from these experiences from you yourself and from other Albanian policymakers. So let me start with the following question. In your presentation, you describe how the government of Albania tackled 3 successive policy crises. So I think the most recent crisis that you described, COVID-19, was unprecedented in some sense, for which there was no textbook response. Albania had had earthquakes in the past, and many countries have had earthquakes in the past, but COVID-19 was unique in the sense that the entire policy world, not just health ministers, but finance ministers, were forced to learn an entire new vocabulary with terms such as lockdowns and flattening the curve, testing and tracing, and implement rapid economic and health response to tackle the effects of the crisis. I am guessing that a lot of learnings were done in the process. So I was wondering, with the benefit of hindsight now, do you think Albania could have improved its COVID-19 response?
Thank you for the question. The short answer is absolutely yes. I think with the benefit of hindsight, even championship teams can manage to do better. Not saying that we did everything perfectly well, but I think that, look, if there's one thing I've learned over the past 8 years is that regardless of the position where you're actually playing, whether I was deputy minister or chief of staff, my profession has basically been to be a firefighter, because there's always an emergency and there's always a running. I mean, smaller countries, Albania has a population of 3.4 million people. A number of them do not live in Albania. They're migrants, but they're holders. There's 4.2 million holders of Albanian passports. In smaller countries, the bureaucracy is slow to react, so the political will is always very, very quick in making the decisions. I think that especially all countries would not have liked to be in such a long lockdown in the beginning. And I think that even now we can do a better job, especially with social isolation indoors. What you're seeing in Eastern Europe is that you cannot really continuously non-stop police people wherever they are. And in most countries in Eastern Europe, and I've had the luck to travel a little bit over the past few months, people are not worrying anymore, because everybody forgets about COVID in the summer. This is what we learned last summer, in the summer of 2020, when the cases went down. Now with the new variant, this is increasingly becoming a bigger issue. So for me, I think we can work a lot better right now, especially on vaccination rates. One of the big problems that you see, not just in Eastern Europe, not just in the Balkans, but you're seeing it even in Central Europe, is this entire mythos that has been built around the vaccines is costing a lot of lives and a lot of problems. And where most of our planning capacity was focused on securing and procuring the vaccines in order to ensure that we don't have another lockdown, a lot of the countries now have the vaccine, but people don't want to take it for whatever conspiracy theory, for whatever they believe will be the effect on them, and for whatever they've chosen to believe at different points in time. And so for me, I wish that we had done not just the government, but all of the political class in Albania, because right before the elections, we got involved into a discussion on whether the Russian vaccine or the Chinese vaccine or this or that were good or bad. I think that now there's enough records to show around the world that the vaccines ensure a form of protection. They can be harmful for a very, very small percentage of people, but by and large, they have ensured that we have much less cases in the emergency rooms and in the IRs. And I think that that is very, very important. And I think we can still win this fight, but we need not make it a political issue anymore, but treat it as a joint issue for all sides to ensure that people are protected against this.
Thank you, Etjen. My next question has to do with the second crisis, and this is to do with the earthquake response. And I want to ask, given the November 2019 experience and taking into consideration the potential eventuality of other natural disasters, how do you think Albania can learn from its recent experience and improve its framework for disaster management?
Now, this is a very hard question, which means it's a good question as well, but you never learn from this. I mean, what usually happens in countries is cyclical. You go into a high alert mode. All of your capacity is bolstered up. You are ready to face the tragedy, because in the immediate we had around 76,000 people that were out of their homes, and we resorted to having them hosted even in hotels along the Riviera, because at one point you couldn't rent any more apartments. That many people were left. You had more than 180,000 units that were damaged. So the response there was that it's good to react fast, and what we learned was that if you join a larger community, you can better face any catastrophe. But what the problem seems to be going forward, and we had issues as everybody else in the Balkans and in Southern Europe had with fires. The problem that we're seeing comes when crises are much wider now. You know, an earthquake is something that is localized to one country or to a couple of countries, because countries here are small. So neighbors can help and pitch in. I think we have learned on how to manage and how to lighten up all the emergency lights really quick and how to react really quick. But the question that is being posed on us looking forward, because of the climate change that is procuring global catastrophes, and because of COVID, which were not regionalized as a crisis, is that we can't really handle this by using just national mechanisms. We need to ensure that there is a multilateral, multinational network of countries and of structures that can react to this quickly and that can help countries get out of them quickly. Because the problem with extended crisis is that you can rebound from a year of losses in growth pretty quickly. But if this is extended over time, then it becomes very problematic, especially now when one of the biggest issues, especially for Europe, is its aging population. And therefore, this creates a demand for younger workers that are usually imported from countries where education is not equal, but very similar, and where they can learn quickly. And this is something that we're seeing now, not just in Albania, but across Eastern Europe. We saw it in countries like Romania. The Economist had a study last year on Bulgaria and how the population there is declining really quickly. This is human capacity. We're more over 7 billion people in the world, and we don't tend to think of people as a resource, but they definitely are, and especially to economies, and especially in times of crisis.
I think the answer is very interesting, not just by itself, but because it leads to my next question, which is about regional cooperation. So I know for a fact that the EU has supported the Western Balkans region, not just Albania, but the other 5 countries, with over 3.3 billion euros through the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wanted to ask, how do you think EU assistance has worked in practice? And what could the EU do more to support growth and capacity building in Albania in particular, given this particular context?
I wasn't aware of the 3.3 billion. I have been aware of 3 different economic packages that have been promised at different times to the Western Balkans. We certainly have received a lot of invaluable help from our EU partners, from individual countries and from the EU itself. But let me venture out a bit and say that the first thing that the EU, I think, needs vis-a-vis countries in the Western Balkans to be clear about what it's doing. Last year, for example, this economic and support package for the Western Balkans was declared that it would be somewhere around 7.7 billion euros. This year, there's a new one that says 13 billion euros for the Western Balkans. The problem is that because of the bureaucracy in Brussels and because each member has to have a say, these mechanisms are not quick enough. One of the things that we learned from this Berlin process, after having the German Chancellor bring the leaders together to sit, is that we can find a way to talk to one another and we can build bridges. But the problem is that we don't have the monetary and the financial means to make these bridges real bridges, to make these roads real roads that will help us share tourism, help us share trade, help us create a common market, because all of the countries in the Western Balkans all together are 17 million. 6 countries have 17 million people. So in terms of us understanding that we don't need to compete with one another, we understand that. What we need is better infrastructure projects that connect us to Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Because then we are not just a geostrategic buffer zone. Then we are part of the EU, and we will eventually be part of the EU, even though we don't know when. And the second thing that I think is maybe more important than the first, but it's more problematic because there's no political cohesion in the decision-making within the EU, because the 26 countries have different political sides governing, so they cannot find cohesion on this and a compromise, is that we need to be very clear that at any other given time in the history of the EU has never accepted new members, and they were individual countries. It's not an individual process, it's always a regional process. Because imagine what happens if, let's say, the US would allow the secession of Texas. What would happen? What would California do? And California is asking every year to stand aside from the Union. They're the 7th economy in the world now, probably the 6th by now. So what would happen if Serbia and Montenegro got in the Union? What would happen to Albania, Bosnia, North Macedonia, or Kosovo? There would be such a great demographic shift and a difference in economic development that the process would have the completely opposite effect of it being a process of development and of being a process of, let's say, convergence to EU standards and levels of income. So I think these are very real issues. We had a lot of attention on this region of the world with the immigrant crisis from Syria 3 years ago. But now it's being treated as a political issue. With Afghanistan and with COVID destabilizing large areas of the world, it may be a problem in the long term. I think the EU in itself has understood that they don't need to be surrounded by buffer nations, but that this region has to eventually integrate with the EU. The problem is that they're so much taken with national problems and then with extra national problems between countries, such as the problem between Bulgaria and North Macedonia now, that Bulgaria is the only country vetoing both Albania and Macedonia, but the process is connected between both countries. These problems, they are superseding the wide agenda of all the countries of the EU. And that agenda should say that the more developed the Balkans are, the more benefit the EU will draw from that. And there should be specific focus, not just in terms of technical assistance, but in terms of real infrastructure funds that can help the countries change their game on the ground.
Thank you, Etjen. To close this section about lessons from the past, I want to ask more personally. Over the last decade, as I summarized in your bio before we started, you held positions on several ministries in Albania as the country tackled these successive crises. What were your personal learnings on crisis management on this period?
So a lot of this, especially managing the crisis, comes from things that I've learned over there. But what I learned is that my people have this unbelievable innate ability to adapt quicker than anything that I've seen. That the new norm, whether it's for the good or for the bad, really becomes a norm really quickly. But especially during the earthquake, because the earthquake was an out of this world experience. It was a very long shock. Everybody got outside, and then you started hearing about things collapsing all over the country, especially in this, which is the more densely populated part of Albania. And I learned that the size of the heart of people does not depend on how much money they have or how much education they have, because we received massive support immediately, and everybody was out on the streets trying to help one another. And in that process, I think, and this was one of the best things that I've seen my people do, we reacted strongly, reacted together, and we all were in unison in trying to help those who were the more severely hit. So as part of my experiences, that experience in this small city north of Tirana, and I was deputy foreign minister at the time, of going there day to day, every day for over 3 months and trying to sort out how damaged these houses were and where these people should live and how they were being fed and if the tents were being put up, because this was the middle of winter at the same time. If there was enough support from the medical side, if all the people in the hotels had issues. I think that in terms of trying to make sense out of all the chaos there, that was something where not just me, but all of the colleagues who helped me and followed me through that endeavor, and certainly the people who did it at a much higher level, such as the government and all the ministers are all deployed in the ground, took this lesson to heart, that if we react together, we are both stronger and a lot more effective.
I think this is very insightful and inspiring for us to close the section on learnings from the past. Starting into the next challenges that Albania will face in the next 1, 3, 5 years, you put a big role in your presentation and in your responses to the importance of accession talks with the EU as a strategic goal for Albania. Given your experience as former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, I wanted to ask, what are the challenges ahead for Albania to complete the EU integration process?
There are many challenges on our path. I mean, we are net exporters of unbelievable political thought. There is an episode of The Simpsons where they actually bring in an Albanian student, and this is basically what he names as one of the 3 exports of Albania. So we managed to shoot ourselves in the foot quite often. Also because we come from a background of communism where you did not have opponents, you had enemies. And regardless of us being a much younger generation than the people who actually set those rules, we're still influenced by it. And this is why the country has to come through catharsis of all of this to get this out of the system. So this is why I say that for us, it will be a hard process, but by beginning with this, so the process has to begin with what is called an intergovernmental conference, where the EU and the countries sit together, and then they set dates, and there's 35 chapters to be negotiated, and they start negotiating the chapters, typically starting from the justice system. This will not be easy for us. Our institutions were not created for this. Our institutions were created from the ruins of a system that had left Albania isolated for 45 years. But this will be very beneficial to us because it will help us create real institutions that carry real value and that can support and help the country, that can fight corruption and organized crime, that can help develop the economy, and most of all, can help our youth stay here. And this is why integration is part of my presentation and all of my answers, because this would be like turning on the light at the end of the tunnel. And if you can see a hope, then you can actually build towards that hope. But if even this process is open-ended and you never know when it's going to happen, then people have a much easier way out. Now they can travel without visa. So as soon as as the borders open up, they can go and do the jobs that they would not do in Albania. This is why I think integration is important, because for the convergence of levels of income of the people, so the reduction of inequality in the continent of Europe, this needs to happen for all countries. That way we can choose to live with less in Albania, but not with that much less. And I think that that will be crucial, not just in terms of the mentality of people. And I think it will have a very, very positive psychological impact, but it will open the door to foreign direct investment. It will open the door to collaboration on a regional level, seeing a future together. And I think that for the Balkans, which is an area of the globe that has been for so many years defined by conflict and by wars and fights, as Churchill used to say, the Balkans create more history than they can manage. This, I think, will be the key. If we see a future together, we can work towards it and we can walk towards it.
Your answer gives us an image of what the future of politics could look like around the EU accession. And I wanted to ask about the future of the Albanian economy. We know that as vaccination advances in Albania and elsewhere, one day or another, we will reach herd immunity and the COVID-19 crisis will be left behind. Nevertheless, Albania will still face significant economic constraints in a variety of areas to accelerate shared prosperity. In this context, what do you think will be Albania's most important economic challenges in the years ahead?
I think the most important challenge that we are facing now, and we will increasingly continue to face, mainly because for the past 3 years we have ended the upwards of the demographic loop and we are now descending demographically, will be to retain its people and to train people enough in order to be able to satisfy the economy. Unemployment is now at 11.2%. By the end of next year, it should be at around 10.4. But we need more bodies to work with the economy, and we need to better prepare them. Our education reform was very good in terms of producing independence for all universities from the public funding and from the political institutions. But at the same time, it should enable them to look forward towards better curricula to produce people that can help the country move forward. Another big challenge that goes with it, because I think the demographic challenge is ultimately the biggest one that we will face, is also to ensure that we manage to return people and to make them come back to Albania. I've left this country when I was 16. I studied in LA, Philadelphia, Paris, and then Boston. I've never thought I would not come back. I think we need more people to come back, to give new ideas, to challenge the people like me who have come back and have been involved in politics, and to help all of us perform better. So the main challenge for us and the main hindrance potentially to growth will be the availability of the human capital and the productivity of that human capital. And I think that we are moving forward in one direction. We have programs now to ensure that people from the diaspora who come back and open businesses have grants and receive the support of the government. But I think that we need to do this on a much more massive scale. Also, and we need to do this on a much more regionally aware mindset, because at the end of the day, we are a country of 3.4 million people. When big companies look at a country like ours, they look at how many, I don't know, how many ITs can we produce in a year, how many economists we produce in a year, and then they deduct on how many will be able to continue to produce, and then they decide whether they should come and invest in Albania or somewhere else. I think with a sharing economy, with big data, we should focus much more on the technological side of everything, and at the same time, we should open up much more to one another regionally so that we can present ourselves as a market of 17 million and not of 2, 3, or 7.
Following on that, I have a question in the Q&A from Ljubica Nedeljkovska, who managed our research in Albania some years back, and it's also on binding constraints to grow. So I'll read the question. Excellent presentation and overview, Etjen. Basically, you asked in your presentation, you connected the reform of the judiciary with the removal of investment barriers and the subsequent inflow of investments. Could you elaborate more on the link between this reform of judiciary and investments? Was it more of a barrier for the inflow of new investments or for the expansion of existing investors?
First of all, hello, Ljubica, long time no see. Thank you for the question and for the excellent work that you did in Albania. I think for both. I think it's a hindrance for both. So the problem is this. You have a country with limited amount of space. In the case of Albania, it's 27,000 square kilometers. And you have a population where ownership is taken by the government in 1947 and onwards, and the government controls everything. Now the system crashes, and you have people who are working in all of these factories that are closing, and farms. So what the government did in 92 was that they made this law, 7501 it's called, the law, where everybody was granted a small plot of land, meaning that you have 2 acres and then somebody else has 2 acres. This was based on how many people lived in the family. This created an extreme problem with the distribution of land, making it fractured, too much for agriculture. And then now come the investors and the owners. And the owners wanted restitution of the land, so they were granted this in some cases. If they wanted to invest in the land, though, they had to ensure that this guy whose plot is here would be pushed. The problem with this was that if you went to the court system in Albania, you could get a ruling with everything. You could have somebody say that, no, this is not Patricio's land, this is Etjen's land. Patricio now has a factory on it, but he should either pay what Etjen is asking or leave the factory to Etjen and go away. We had an issue with a few investors with the previous government where they would come, they would start the investment, and then they would have some court case, and to the point where this was the main issue for all Albanians. Not corruption. Corruption was number 7 at the time. The arrogance of the government was one of the top ones, but the justice system, because it expanded so much that it became an up for sale. And so it was a bidding war. If you entered into a case of divorce, whoever paid the judge the more got the ruling in his favor. And this created a system of disbelief in the entirety of the legislation. And we at the time were doing the same as we're doing now. We're receiving counseling from the European institutions, the EU, the US, all of our partners in making the laws. The problem was that regardless of how the laws were executed, if you ever went to court, we had cases where foreign companies would come and work in Albania, and then all of a sudden the Albanian company would say and go to court for this, all of their equipment is ours. And because they were cousins of the judge would say, no, this is not the equipment of the foreign company. So the foreign company would never come back. This is why it became very crucial for us. And this is why we have such a, because it's quite a severe reform for the justice system. We are vetting every prosecutor and every judge in Albania, looking at their wealth and what they have registered, and if they can justify it, to try and find these things out. And of course, they all say that they are not corrupt, but this process will help us bring justice to justice. And then once people know that there's a justice system, that then there cannot be corruption, because then you go to court, that you cannot steal somebody's property. So then also foreign investors know that the justice system in this country can help solve any issue that there may be in this country. Whereas up until 8 years ago, and even after 2013, we had major cases where it was always the foreign investor had a court case with the subcontractors, 10 out of 10 times, whoever paid the more, and some of them started paying, even the foreigners, and that completely destroys the system. And this is why I think it's very crucial for both the expansion, so the capability of Albanian people to invest in their plot of land or to try and do something, and not be hostages to a justice system, but also for foreign investors to invest in Albania. I think this is one of the key reforms that will help us grow on a completely different level.
Thank you, Etjen. I had another question from the audience that I think on a topic we haven't touched, and I think it might be interesting to at least have a short response of. So an audience member asked about the increase in public debt due to the pandemic. It says that the debt increased from 78% to 87% in the last 2 years. This is common to other emerging markets and advanced economies due to COVID-19. And his question is, since we know that manageable public debts are sometimes around the benchmark of 60% of GDP, how do we expect the government to deal with high levels of debt? Are these a risk to the Albanian future? And what policies could be expected to tackle this risk? I thought this was an interesting question that we could probably address.
Thank you for the question. I cannot see the people who are asking, but you're probably okay. But it's a very good question, regardless of it being now a main point of discord between the government and the opposition. It's very good to be able to clarify this. So we did have a ceiling of 60%. In 2011, when we were building this the biggest public infrastructure project in Albania is the road, the highway, in terms of costs, the highway connecting Albania to Kosovo. And then the previous government shattered the ceiling. The debt went up automatically by 12% over 1 year. And then they kept on going, and we found issues with even with invoices that were unpaid. So we had a lot of expenditures of the government that had gone unpaid. And because of it, as part of this IMF program, we went into debt reduction strategy. And for 3 years, we did very well. Debt was going down. It continued in it continued in 2017. And then in 2018, as we were seeing some hindrances to growth, we had to invest more in public projects. And so we started the debt reduction trajectory slowed. With the earthquake and the reconstruction process, we had to enter into this immediately. So of course, when you have a hit of 4% negative growth in a year, but the hit took down all of our growth. So it was probably around 7% of GDP in real terms at the end of the year from what was expected. When you have that kind of hit, it means that you have to increase public spending. And of course, with COVID, the same thing happened. Now, this is something that all countries do. There's 3 ways of spending more to face the issues, to be able to extend crediting, to be able to pay people a salary while under lockdown, to be able to offer a guarantee, a sovereign guarantee to companies that have basically no exchange anymore because there's no trade and there's no international travel. The first one is increasing the public debt. The second one is increasing inflation, which will automatically hit the savings of people. And the third one, which is always actually the first one, it's to increase taxes. Now, most countries in the world chose to do the first one, so to increase debt. That was the choice Albania made as well. Debt reduction strategy is what we are planning to do over the next 9 years, so that we go back down towards 60%. But the problem is this, and this has been the dilemma of Greece after the Greek crisis. If you go into debt reduction strategy and you crash through it, it actually hampers economic growth to a point where you continue to grow negatively. And this is actually what exactly happened to Greece. So our economic program for this mandate is that we will start from next year to decrease debt, but we have to keep a pretty high budget deficit because we need to invest in things that are crucial to producing economic growth. So in this trade-off, we will go down as far as debt and go down slowly. Now, the point you make is very fair, but that 60% is so outdated to now be ridiculous. It used to be one of the canons of the European Union. It could be for our process as well, but not right now. Not where the average debt of the 26 countries of the EU is 86.2%, the average. If you take out Germany, the Czech Republic, and there's a couple of them who have their debt below 60, the real debt of all countries in Europe, other than 4, is probably higher, not probably, but it's higher than 100%. And I don't think that just having that metric should constrain us from looking at what's really happening. Look at Japan, public debt to 112% of GDP. They seem to be doing all right. And they've carried that kind of debt for over 2 decades now. So for us, the key is to trigger growth, because if there's growth, then debt will go automatically down. And if you look at all of the recent processes of us borrowing money from international markets, basically our credit rating has continuously improved. So that goes to prove that not even international financing institutions or the Standard and Poor's of the world don't view that as a metric that is actually applicable to today's economies and today's situation.
Thank you, Etjen. For my next question, I'm also going to bring a Growth Lab fellow. I'm going to bring Tim O'Brien, who's a senior manager here at the Growth Lab, and who had a question.
You guys are all there, aren't you?
We're hidden, but we're here.
Hi, Etjen. Good to see you. Good to hear from you. It was a great presentation, and I really appreciate your thoughtful comments. Just one simple question I wanted to ask is, after so many years of Growth Lab work in Albania, what do you feel like we get wrong when we talk about Albania, the economy, the society? Curious if anything stands out. Thank you.
Wow. That's a complex question. I don't think you got anything wrong necessarily. I think that one of the things that I really appreciated about the Growth Lab and all of you guys and all the team that worked with Ricardo, Matt Andrews, and everybody else, Ljubica, of course, Pete, team, both teams, is that I've worked in development before. That was my first job coming out of college. And the issue that I've always had with these multilateral institutions is their one-size-fits-all approach to all the issues of the countries. Whereas with the CID, it was completely different, because you guys understood that if something worked in Venezuela 25 years ago, we could not go down the exact same path. I think that one place where we maybe made a mistake, but it wasn't solely yours, it was together, was in understanding the capacity for implementation. The problem is that some of these issues are not just complicated, they're complex. And of course, all bureaucracies, watch Brussels, they're very resistant to change, and they're very resistant to things that will take them out of one routine and throw them into the midst of an unknown where other people will tell them what to do. So they're naturally resistant to this. And I think that this is something that we should have we should have calculated better the capacity for implementation and the timing of everything, because very often in small countries where decision making is centralized, as it is, and it's only normal to be in smaller countries, because you cannot decentralize it at an extended level. The problem even becomes with who's who. So we always talk about how great people talk about issues and not about people, but sometimes in smaller countries it's about the people who make the decisions. So I think that in our algorithm of work, and I believe that we did some very good things together, and a lot of it did not maybe translate into a policy that bore the name of the CID or the Growth Lab, but I think that a lot of the lessons that we have learned and a lot of the things that we are trying to implement in our daily routines, not just as executive, but even for me now in the legislative, were learned from these processes. And so I think that you guys should be in Albania now, helping us with this. I don't think that it ends here. So, and I think that definitely with the work that Ermal is doing now, and of course, Ljubica, for example, worked on a lot of the tables and stats for every economic policy that we did back in those days, have had a very, very important role to play and will still have a very important role to play. So I don't think it was necessarily a mistake. I think it's always miscalculation. It's always the things that come along the path. One of the things that we have in the Balkans is that whatever you write a policy, you can never implement it that exact way, because there's always so many complications along the path, then it will change. So the capacity to be very reactive to ensure that the core is maintained and that regardless of how many things change, this is maintained. I think that is one of the biggest lessons that our government has drawn from the last two crises. And we are now trying to push on products, on product orientation a lot more, and project orientation a lot more than just on general policy, because the further you get from this decision-making tip of the iceberg, let's say, or of the pyramid, the more complex it becomes to pass on the message. And we in this area of the world have this, don't know, probably people watching have this game as well. It's called the broken telephone, where you speak to somebody's ear, and even if you try to say those words and don't try to play it funny along the path, what comes out at the end, it's completely different from what started. I think that is one of the issues that we had. But you guys should come back.
Thank you for your words, Etjen. As we reach the end of the event, I had a final question for you, and it comes without saying that we're virtually right now in the Harvard Kennedy School, so I have to ask you about this. You were a graduate of the mid-career MBA program a while back in 2016 in the Harvard Kennedy School. I wanted to ask you, how did your experience in the program prepare you for the challenge of public policy and public office?
I think it was one of the best, not probably, it was my best academic experience, not just because of it being Harvard, but I think that in terms of interacting with the people, that school and the programs offer something that is quite unique, especially when you come in, as I did at 34, having had 12 years of experience on the ground and being able to ask very specific questions to professors such as Ricardo Hausmann and even Heifetz. So the answers were not answers that were set in stone. They were always things that helped you build on experience and try to learn when you redid things later. Even with math on the level of analysis that we went through some of these classes, all of that comes back time and again to different points of my career. The last very important one of it being my own political campaign, this time where a lot of these things help you understand the people that you are talking to, the people that you are working with, and especially how they see you from the outside. And I think that that perspective is something that is quite unique to the program and to the Kennedy School, because I lived on the business school campus, right? So it's very different on that side of the river, let me tell you that. I took a class at the business school and people would not even speak to one another. And I think in terms of community building and in terms of sharing with people, because I also had an amazing cohort of people. Most of us still talk to one another quite frequently. A buddy of mine from Kosovo just ran and had an amazing campaign in Pristina for the municipality of the capital, triplicating the result of the previous guy from his party. So I think the people experience there has been a turning point, because it helps to read books, articles, to watch videos, to learn things, but it's people who help us put it into perspective. And if they are the right people, then that perspective becomes experience and becomes a learning process from which you can never really plug off. And for that, I am very thankful.
Thank you, Etjen, for those words. And with that being said, I want to thank you for being here with us in this event. I think we had a great time and we learned a lot. We will hope to see you back again in future events. And for the rest of you, audience, we'll be seeing you back in December for our last talk of the semester with Minister Shimi from Namibia. Thank you all and have a good end of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking your time and for listening to this.